Michael Carter never imagined that a single night could turn his entire life into a nightmare. He was a hardworking man, balancing 2 jobs to provide for his 9-year-old daughter, Emily. His world revolved around her. She was his only family after his wife passed away 3 years ago. Despite the struggles, he always managed to put a smile on his face for her. That evening, he had just finished his late shift at the diner and was on his way home, excited to surprise Emily with a small gift, a bracelet she had admired at a local store. But fate had something else in store. As he drove through the rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles, headlights from an incoming truck blinded him. Before he could react, a deafening crash sent his car spinning off the road. The next thing he knew, he was waking up to the sterile white lights of a hospital room. His body ached, his vision blurred, and the beeping of machines filled the air. As he tried to move, a sharp pain shot through his ribs. Panic set in. Where was Emily? His heart pounded as he turned to the nurse entering the room. "My daughter. Where is she?" His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. The nurse hesitated before answering, her face clouded with concern. "Sir, you were alone in the car when the paramedics found you." Michael's mind reeled. That could not be true. Emily had been waiting for him at home. He had texted her before leaving work. He forced himself up despite the pain, his pulse racing. He needed to find her. But as soon as he tried to stand, darkness took over, and he collapsed back onto the bed. When he regained consciousness, a police officer was standing beside his bed. "Mr. Carter, we need to ask you some questions," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Your daughter, do you have any idea where she might be?" Michael's stomach twisted. "She was home waiting for me. I was on my way back." The officer exchanged a look with the nurse before sighing. "Your apartment building caught fire last night. The fire department responded, but there was no sign of your daughter inside." Michael felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His home was gone. His daughter was missing. His hands trembled as he clutched the hospital blanket. "No, that's not possible. She has to be somewhere. Someone must have seen her." The officer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're doing everything we can to locate her." But Michael knew what that meant. He was now completely alone, and no one was coming to save him. Discharged from the hospital with nowhere to go, Michael found himself wandering the streets of Los Angeles, a shell of the man he used to be. He had lost everything: his daughter, his home, his job. His savings had been drained by medical bills. No friends, no relatives to turn to. The city moved on around him, oblivious to his suffering. Each night he slept on a different park bench, his body aching from the cold, his mind haunted by Emily's laughter. He replayed every memory of her, afraid that if he stopped thinking about her, she would truly be gone. He spent his days searching, checking shelters, hospitals, even waiting outside the police station for any updates. But days turned into weeks and there was no sign of her. One evening, exhausted and starving, he sat outside a small cafe, watching people walk by, wrapped in their own lives. He had long stopped expecting help from strangers. But then, a man in a cap and sunglasses slowed down as he passed. For a brief moment their eyes met, and something about the way the man looked at him felt different. Like he truly saw him, not just another homeless person on the street. "How long have you been looking for her?" the man asked, his voice calm yet serious. Michael hesitated, surprised that a stranger had even stopped to ask. "Too long," he murmured, "but no one cares anymore." The man nodded slightly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Get yourself something warm to eat," he said, placing it beside Michael before walking away. Michael stared after him, something nagging at the back of his mind. There was something familiar about him, but he was too exhausted to think clearly. That night, as he huddled against a building for warmth, he wondered if he would ever find Emily. He had never felt more lost, but something was about to change. The next morning, as he sat outside the same cafe, sipping a hot coffee he had bought with the stranger's money, a woman approached him. She looked like she worked at a shelter, but there was urgency in her expression. "Someone left this for you," she said, handing him a piece of paper. It was an address and a phone number. "They said it's about your daughter." Michael's breath caught in his throat. Could this be real? He had spent weeks searching with no luck, and now, out of nowhere, a stranger had left him a clue. His hands shook as he dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Go to the address, you'll find what you're looking for." Before he could ask any questions, the call ended. His heart pounded as he looked up at the woman. "Who gave this to you?" She hesitated, then said, "He didn't leave a name. Just said it was important." Michael didn't waste another second. With what little strength he had left, he made his way across the city, clutching onto the fragile hope that had suddenly appeared. When he reached the address, it was a sleek, modern office building, far from the places he had been searching. A receptionist greeted him with a knowing look, handing him a folder. "I was told to give this to you." Inside was a case report, Emily's case report. His eyes scanned the pages, his breath catching when he saw the last known location recorded. She had been placed in a foster home 2 weeks ago. His knees nearly buckled. She was alive. Tears blurred his vision as he looked back at the receptionist. "Who arranged this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman hesitated before finally saying, "The man who helped you was Tom Cruise." Michael felt the world tilt. The stranger at the cafe, the one who had looked at him with genuine concern, it had been him. But why? Why would Tom Cruise, one of the biggest stars in the world, help a man like him? The receptionist smiled slightly. "He didn't want you to know. He just wanted to help." Michael clutched the file to his chest, overwhelmed. He had spent so long believing no one cared, yet a man who owed him nothing had quietly changed his fate forever, and he had done it without asking for any recognition. That night, as Michael lay on a proper bed for the first time in weeks, he whispered a silent thank you. He had thought he was alone in this world, but someone, somewhere, had still been watching over him. Michael Carter had always believed in resilience. He had endured hardships before, but nothing compared to the emptiness he felt now. The loss of his daughter, the destruction of his home, and the cruel reality of waking up every morning without any direction, it was suffocating. The streets of Los Angeles had never felt colder. Nights stretched into eternity as he lay on concrete sidewalks, curled against the biting wind, listening to the distant sounds of laughter from people who had lives to return to. He had become invisible, just another faceless soul swallowed by the city's indifference. The first few days were the hardest. His body still bore the bruises from the accident, and moving felt like dragging dead weight. The hunger gnawed at him mercilessly. He could feel his ribs pressing against his skin, a stark reminder that his body was deteriorating just as rapidly as his hope. He tried seeking help at a local shelter, but space was limited, and he was always met with the same apologetic yet dismissive gaze. "We're full tonight," they would say, offering him a blanket as if it were enough to shield him from the cruel world. He had no ID, no money, nothing that could prove he even existed anymore. Every morning, he forced himself to continue his search for Emily. He walked to hospitals, peered into windows of shelters, and stopped police officers with trembling hands asking the same desperate question. "Have you found my daughter?" But the answers were always the same, sympathetic yet empty. "We're looking, sir. We'll let you know if anything turns up. Have you checked the local foster system?" Of course he had, but without any legal paperwork or an address to list as his residence, no one would even allow him to inquire about her case. The system was built in a way that only those who already had something were allowed access. For people like him, there was no way in. It was on one of these desperate, cold nights that Michael found himself outside a small cafe, staring into the warmth inside, watching families share meals, lovers exchange laughter, and workers sip their coffee in peace. He had not eaten in 2 days. His throat burned from dehydration. His legs ached from exhaustion. But the worst pain was the emptiness in his chest. He had started losing hope. The man he once was, determined, loving, full of fight, was fading into someone unrecognizable. He lowered his head, ashamed of what he had been reduced to. That was when he felt someone's gaze on him. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was just another person glancing at him with either pity or disdain, the way most people did when they saw the homeless. But then, a voice broke through the fog in his mind. "How long have you been looking for her?" The voice was calm, steady. Michael lifted his head slowly and met the eyes of a man standing before him. He wore a cap, sunglasses masking most of his face, but there was something about him, something familiar. Michael hesitated before responding. He barely had the energy to form words, but something about this man's presence made him feel like he had to answer. "Too long," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "But no one cares anymore." The man didn't react the way most people did. There was no false sympathy, no empty reassurance. He simply nodded as if he truly understood. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Get yourself something warm to eat," he said, placing it on the ground beside Michael before walking away. Michael watched him disappear into the crowd, his mind spinning. He had been given small amounts of change before, coins tossed his way with hurried footsteps, as if people wanted to rid themselves of guilt. But this was different. This wasn't a careless gesture. The man had spoken to him, acknowledged him, and given him enough to actually buy a meal. It wasn't just money. It was a sign that someone had seen him, truly seen him. For the first time in weeks, Michael stepped inside the cafe, feeling the warmth of a place he had once taken for granted. He ordered a simple meal, just enough to ease the hunger, but not too much to waste the money. As he ate, he found himself glancing around, wondering if the man was still nearby, watching him. Something about the interaction didn't sit right. Who was he? And why did his voice feel oddly familiar? That night, for the first time since losing Emily, Michael allowed himself to feel something other than despair. He didn't know why, but he felt like things were about to change. He had no proof, no logical reason to believe it, but something in his gut told him that this encounter had not been a coincidence. Someone had noticed him, someone who mattered. The next morning, as he sat outside the same cafe, warming his hands around a cup of coffee he had bought with the remaining money, a woman approached him. She was dressed in clean, professional clothes, her expression unreadable. "Are you Michael Carter?" she asked. Michael stiffened. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken his name. "Yeah." "Who's asking?" he replied cautiously. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "Someone left this for you." Michael's heart pounded as he unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note with a phone number and an address. The message was short but carried a weight that nearly made him lose his breath. "Go to this address, you'll find what you're looking for." His hands trembled as he looked back up at the woman. "Who gave this to you?" She hesitated before answering. "He didn't leave a name, just said it was important." Michael felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. His exhausted body suddenly felt awake. Could this finally be the break he had been waiting for? Could this be the clue that would lead him back to Emily? He had spent weeks searching blindly, running in circles with no direction. And now, out of nowhere, someone had handed him a lead. He didn't hesitate. With what little strength he had left, he set off towards the address, his pulse racing. He didn't know who was behind this or what he was walking into, but he didn't care. If there was even the slightest chance that this could bring him closer to his daughter, he had to take it. As he walked through the streets of Los Angeles, his mind replayed the events of the past 24 hours. The man at the cafe, the $100 bill, the way he had spoken to Michael, not with pity, but with understanding. And now, this note. It all felt connected, but he couldn't quite piece it together yet. He arrived at the location just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a modern office building, far different from the places he had been searching. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The receptionist looked up as if she had been expecting him. Without a word, She handed him a folder. Michael's fingers shook as he opened it. His breath caught in his throat. Inside was a case report, his daughter's case report. His eyes scanned the pages, desperate to find her last known location. And there it was, a foster home. 2 weeks ago, she was alive. His knees nearly buckled as relief and disbelief crashed over him. He had been searching for so long, convinced that no one was looking out for him. But someone had been. Someone had used their influence to find Emily when the system had failed him. His voice was barely a whisper when he looked back at the receptionist. "Who arranged this?" She hesitated, then spoke softly. "The man who helped you was Tom Cruise." Michael felt his entire world tilt. The man at the cafe, the $100 bill. The way he had looked at Michael with genuine concern. It had been him all along. Tom Cruise, one of the biggest stars in the world, had seen him, had helped him, and had done it all without ever revealing his identity. And in that moment, Michael realized something. True kindness doesn't seek recognition, it doesn't ask for applause. The most powerful acts of generosity are the ones done in silence, expecting nothing in return. Michael Carter stood frozen in the sleek modern office lobby, his mind struggling to process what he had just been told. Tom Cruise? The same Tom Cruise who was one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood? It seemed impossible. Why would a man with the world at his feet, fame, fortune, and influence, go out of his way to help a complete stranger like him? He wanted to ask more questions, but the receptionist simply gave him a knowing smile before returning to her work, as if nothing extraordinary had just been revealed. His hands trembled as he clutched the file containing information about Emily. His daughter was alive. After weeks of wandering the streets, fighting against hopelessness, he finally had a direction. He took a shaky breath, turned on his heel, and rushed out of the building. He needed to find her. As he stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the towering skyscrapers. The weight of exhaustion still pressed heavily on him, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than despair: hope. He flagged down a passing taxi, barely able to form words as he gave the address to the foster home. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, probably noticing the disheveled man who looked as though he had not slept in days. But Michael did not care. His pulse hammered in his ears. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The ride felt unbearably long. His mind was racing, imagining every possible scenario. Would Emily recognize him? Would she be scared? Had she been told he abandoned her? The idea made his throat tighten. He could not bear the thought of her thinking he had given up on her. When the car finally pulled up outside the small foster home, his breath caught in his throat. It was a modest brick building with a small playground in the front. He could hear children laughing somewhere inside. His heart pounded as he climbed out of the taxi, his legs almost giving way beneath him. He took slow, hesitant steps toward the entrance, his palms sweaty. A woman with kind eyes opened the door before he could knock. She took one look at him and seemed to understand everything without him having to say a word. "You must be Michael," she said softly. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yes, my daughter. Emily. She's here, right?" The woman gave him a gentle smile. "She's inside. She's been waiting for you." The words nearly brought him to his knees, waiting for him. The thought that she had been holding on, just like he had, made his chest tighten with emotion. He followed the woman through the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, bracing himself for the moment he had dreamed of for so long. And then he saw her. Emily was sitting on a small chair, hugging a worn-out stuffed bear he had given her on her last birthday. She looked thinner, her hair slightly messy, but she was still his little girl. As if sensing his presence, she lifted her head, her big brown eyes locking onto his. There was a beat of silence. Then her lips parted, and in a broken whisper she said, "Daddy." Michael let out a choked sob, his knees finally giving way as he fell to the floor. "Emily," He opened his arms, and in an instant she was running to him. She crashed into him, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck, and he held her so tightly that he feared he might break her. His body shook with silent sobs as he buried his face in her hair. "I'm so sorry, baby," he whispered. I tried so hard to find you." Emily pulled back slightly, her small hands cupping his face. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." Michael closed his eyes, pressing a kiss to her forehead. He had thought he had lost everything, but in this moment, he realized that as long as he had her, he had everything he needed. The woman who had led him inside gave them a few minutes before clearing her throat gently. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong," she said. "She told us she had a dad who loved her and that you would come for her. We didn't doubt her for a second." Michael swallowed the emotion clogging his throat and nodded. "Thank you for keeping her safe." The woman smiled. "You should also thank the person who made sure you got here." Michael's brows furrowed. "Tom Cruise." The woman's smile deepened. "He called personally. He made sure she was safe. He's been checking in every few days. He never told us why, but he seemed invested." Michael was speechless. A man like Tom Cruise had no reason to help a complete nobody like him, and yet he had. Not just with money, not just with resources, but with genuine care. He had ensured that Emily was safe. He had guided Michael to her without ever demanding credit. Why? The answer hit him like a freight train, because true kindness doesn't need recognition. Tom Cruise had done all of this, saved his daughter, saved him, without asking for anything in return. No media, no publicity, no cameras. He had just helped. Because he could. Because he wanted to. That night, Michael and Emily sat under the stars on the small porch of the foster home. She had fallen asleep in his lap, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt as if afraid he might disappear again. He stroked her hair, his eyes misty as he thought about everything that had happened. Then, he made a silent promise to himself. He would find Tom Cruise. He needed to thank him. The next morning, Michael made his way back to the office where he had received the file. But when he arrived, the receptionist simply shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's no record of any appointments or files under your name." Michael frowned. "That's not possible. I was here yesterday." She gave him an apologetic look. "I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing in our system." It was as if Tom Cruise had erased every trace of his involvement. No paper trail, no proof. Just a man who had seen another man struggling and decided to change his life, without ever expecting a thank you. Michael stepped outside, looking up at the sky, a small smile forming on his lips. He had no way of reaching Tom, no way of repaying him. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best way to honor what Tom had done was to do the same for someone else. As he walked down the street, Emily's tiny hand in his, he whispered under his breath, "Thank you, Tom. I'll never forget." Because sometimes, the greatest acts of kindness are the ones that no one ever hears about. Michael Carter walked out of the foster home with Emily's tiny hand gripping his own. The warmth of her touch grounded him, a stark contrast to the cold reality he had endured for weeks. His body was weak, his mind still struggling to process everything that had happened, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was no longer alone. He had his daughter back. That should have been enough. And yet, something still nagged at him. Tom Cruise. The name echoed in his mind over and over again. How had a Hollywood legend, a man known across the globe, taken such a personal interest in his life? Why had he gone to such great lengths to help a complete stranger? And why had he done it all without expecting anything in return? Michael could not shake the feeling that there was something deeper to this, something he did not yet understand. As he and Emily made their way through the city, he realized that he had no plan beyond this moment. They had nowhere to go. He still had no money, no job, no home. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on him, but he refused to let Emily see his fear. She had been through enough. He needed to stay strong for her. "Daddy, where are we going now?" Emily asked softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. Michael forced a smile, squeezing her hand gently. "Somewhere safe, sweetheart. I promise. But where?" That was when he remembered the note, the one that had led him to Emily. He pulled it from his pocket and stared at the address written on it. There had been no explanation, no signature, just a message. "Go to this address. You'll find what you're looking for." Whoever had left it had known about Emily. They had known where to find her. And if they had known that, then maybe they also knew what came next. Michael flagged down a taxi and handed the driver the note. The man studied the address before nodding and pulling onto the road. As they drove through the city, Michael could feel Emily growing more and more tired beside him. He wrapped his arm around her, letting her lean against his chest. She had been so strong, stronger than any child should ever have to be. The taxi came to a stop in front of a large gated property. Michael frowned, stepping out of the car and staring up at the towering building before him. It looked nothing like the sleek office from before. This was different, more personal, more private. A man in a suit was waiting for them at the entrance. "Mr. Carter," he greeted, his expression unreadable. "Please follow me." Michael hesitated, glancing down at Emily. She was too tired to question anything, her small fingers gripping his hand trustingly. With a deep breath, he followed the man through the gates. They were led inside a grand yet surprisingly modest home. The air was warm, filled with the faint scent of cedarwood and something comforting, like fresh coffee. The place did not scream celebrity wealth the way Michael had expected. It felt lived in. The man motioned toward a sitting area. "Please wait here." Michael settled onto the couch, pulling Emily onto his lap as she rested her head against his shoulder. He glanced around the room, his nerves on edge. Then, before he could process what was happening, he heard footsteps. A figure entered the room and Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. There was no mistaking him now. He was no longer wearing sunglasses or a cap to conceal his identity. This was the man the entire world knew, the action star, the billionaire, the legend. But at that moment, standing there in front of Michael, he was just a man. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, Tom let out a small chuckle and crossed his arms. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Michael frowned, confusion flickering across his face. He recognized him immediately. But that was not what Tom meant. There was something deeper in his voice, something personal. Michael's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. And then, like a puzzle piece clicking into place, the memory hit him. A dinner, years ago. He had been a waiter, working the late shift to make ends meet. One night, a man had come in alone, wearing a cap pulled low over his face. He had ordered nothing but a cup of coffee, and Michael had noticed that he seemed off, tired, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Michael had done something that, at the time, had seemed so small. He had refilled the man's coffee before he even asked, then left a slice of pie on the table with a simple note. "Rough day. On the house." The man had looked up, surprised. He had stared at Michael for a long moment before giving a small nod of gratitude. And then, without another word, he had left. Michael had never thought about it again. Until now. His eyes widened as he looked at Tom. "That was you." Tom smiled, leaning against the wall. "That was me." Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was, 5 years ago?" Tom nodded. "I was filming a movie. It was a tough time for me. You probably don't remember, but I was going through a lot of bad press back then. The media was tearing me apart. I felt like I couldn't go anywhere without being followed, criticized, dissected." He paused. "That night at the diner, I just needed a break. And then this random guy," he motioned toward Michael, "noticed. You didn't ask me who I was. You didn't try to get anything out of me. You just showed kindness. For no reason other than because you could. Michael could not believe what he was hearing. And you remembered that? Tom's expression grew serious. I remember every act of kindness. The world doesn't have enough of them. Michael swallowed the lump forming in his throat. So, that's why you helped me? Tom shook his head. No. He glanced at Emily, who was now fast asleep in Michael's arms. I helped you because you deserved it. Because no father should ever have to search for his child alone. Because you weren't invisible, no matter how much the world tried to make you feel that way. Michael felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Gratitude, disbelief, overwhelming relief. I don't know how to thank you, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. Tom smiled. You already did, 5 years ago. Silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. Then, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. He held it out to Michael. There's an apartment. It's not fancy, but it's yours. There's a job waiting for you too if you want it. No strings attached. Michael hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. But then he looked down at Emily, at the peaceful way she was sleeping in his arms. This was not about pride. This was about giving her a future. With a deep breath, he took the key. Thank you, he whispered. Tom nodded. Just promise me one thing. Michael met his gaze. Tom's voice was soft but firm. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. No cameras, no credit, just because you can. Michael swallowed past the lump in his throat. I will. Tom smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael truly believed that everything was going to be okay. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest impact. And sometimes the people who seem untouchable are the ones who understand what it means to be seen the most. Michael sat in the living room of the apartment Tom Cruise had arranged for him, his mind struggling to comprehend how much had changed in just a matter of days. A week ago, he had been sleeping on the streets, hopeless, broken, and convinced that the world had forgotten him. And now here he was, sitting in a warm home, watching his daughter peacefully sleep on the couch beside him. The small apartment was modest, but to Michael it felt like a palace. The fridge was stocked, the beds were freshly made, and for the first time in weeks, he did not have to wonder where their next meal would come from. He had spent the entire day trying to adjust to this new reality. Every time he looked at Emily, he felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. She was here. She was safe. That alone should have been enough. And yet, something kept pulling at his mind. Tom Cruise had done all of this for him. Why? He was not a man who sought public validation for his actions. He had helped in complete secrecy, making sure no cameras, no media, and no reporters knew about it. Why would someone as powerful as Tom Cruise choose to help him, a man who had lost everything? A sudden knock at the door pulled Michael from his thoughts. He hesitated before slowly rising to his feet, careful not to wake Emily. His heart pounded as he approached the door, his mind racing with possibilities. When he opened it, he was met with the same well-dressed man who had guided him to Tom Cruise's home. The man gave him a small nod before handing him a sealed envelope. "This is for you," he said simply before turning and walking away. Michael stared at the envelope in his hands. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. His breath caught in his throat when he noticed the small T written in the corner. Tom. Slowly, he stepped back inside and closed the door, his fingers trembling as he tore open the seal. Inside there were two things, a handwritten letter and another smaller envelope. He unfolded the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the words. "I know you must be wondering why I did what I did. The truth is, I could give you a dozen reasons, but none of them would probably make sense to you right now. Let's just say that once upon a time I was in a place where I felt lost too. I was surrounded by people, but I felt invisible. And then, one day someone showed me kindness when I least expected it. They didn't ask for anything in return, they just did it because they could. That moment stayed with me forever. You helped me once, even if you don't remember it. But that's not why I helped you. I did it because I could, and now I want you to do the same for someone else when the time comes. Inside the second envelope, you'll find something that might make things easier for you and Emily. You don't have to take it, but if you do, promise me one thing. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. No cameras, no credit, just because you can. Take care of Emily. She's lucky to have you." Michael's hands shook as he finished reading. His vision blurred slightly, his throat tightening. He had spent weeks believing he was nothing, that no one saw him, that he was just another forgotten face in a world that did not care. And yet, Tom Cruise, a man who owed him nothing, had seen him, and not just seen him, but changed his life in a way he could never repay. With shaky fingers, he opened the second envelope. His breath hitched. Inside was a check large enough to not only get him back on his feet, but to ensure that he and Emily never had to struggle again. Enough to secure a home, a stable future, and to erase the months of suffering they had endured. Michael nearly dropped the paper. He could not breathe. This was too much. Tom had already given him more than he could ever dream of. A home, his daughter, a second chance. And now this? It felt impossible to accept. His pride warred with his desperation. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to find Tom and tell him that he had already done enough. But then he looked at Emily. She was still sleeping soundly, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She had been through so much, more than any child should have to endure. This was not about pride. This was about her future, her safety, her happiness. Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He knew what he had to do. He would take the gift, but he would also keep his promise. Life had changed in ways Michael never imagined. With Tom's help, he had managed to secure a stable job at a community center, working with people who had been in the same position as he once was. He now spent his days helping others rebuild their lives, just as someone had once helped him. Emily was thriving. She had started school again, making friends, laughing more. The light in her eyes had returned. She no longer woke up crying in the middle of the night. She no longer clung to him in fear that he might disappear again. Slowly, they were healing. And Michael? He was learning to trust in kindness again. One evening, as he walked home from work, he saw a man sitting outside a small cafe, the same cafe where his life had unknowingly changed forever. The man was hunched over, shivering, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollow. Michael knew that look. Without hesitation, he stepped inside the cafe, ordered an extra cup of coffee and a warm meal. Then, he walked back outside and placed it in front of the man. The man blinked up at him in surprise. "Why?" Michael smiled. "Because I can." As he turned to walk away, he knew. This was the lesson Tom had wanted him to learn. It was never about repaying him. It was about passing it on. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness are the ones that change lives the most. Michael Carter sat on the small balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. A year ago, he had stood on these same streets with nothing but a broken spirit and a desperate hope that the world had not completely abandoned him. Now, everything had changed. His daughter was safe, he had a steady job, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control over his own life. But no matter how much time passed, one thought never left his mind. Tom Cruise. Tom had stepped into his life when Michael had lost everything, not for recognition, not for publicity, but simply because he could. That single act of kindness had saved him. And now, Michael found himself in a place where he could do the same for others. He had kept his promise, helping people in the shadows the way Tom had once helped him. He saw the ones who felt invisible because he had once been invisible too. He knew what it was like to have nothing, to feel forgotten, to wonder if anyone would ever see you again. And now, he made sure no one around him ever felt that way. Earlier that day, he had used part of the money Tom had given him to help a single mother who had been evicted from her apartment. She had nowhere to go, much like he had not so long ago. Michael had found her a safe place, paid for a temporary stay, and given her enough money to get back on her feet. When she asked him why he was helping her, his answer had been simple, the same answer that had once been given to him. Because I can. He leaned back in his chair, glancing through the window at Emily, who was fast asleep. She had finally found peace after all the chaos they had endured. She no longer had nightmares, no longer clung to him in fear of losing him again. That alone made everything worth it. She had her childhood back, her laughter, her innocence. And it was all because of a man who had chosen to care when no one else had. Michael had thought about reaching out to Tom, about thanking him personally, but deep down, he knew that Tom had never wanted thanks. That was not the kind of man he was. He had given Michael his life back, not for gratitude, but because he believed in passing kindness forward. And so, Michael honored him in the only way that mattered, by continuing the cycle. One evening, while walking home from work, he saw a young man sitting alone outside a diner, his head hung low, his clothes worn and dirty. Something about him struck Michael. He knew that posture, that defeated look in his eyes. He had been that man once. Without hesitation, he walked inside the diner, ordered an extra meal, and walked back out. He placed the food in front of the man, who looked up at him with tired, disbelieving eyes. "Why?" the young man asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Michael smiled, the words coming easily now, as if they had always been his own. "Because I can." The young man blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Michael did not wait for thanks. He simply nodded and walked away, knowing that in some small way, he had just changed a life. As he continued down the street, he thought back to the letter Tom had once given him. Inside, Tom had written that he, too, had once been lost, that someone had shown him kindness when he least expected it, and he had never forgotten. It was a cycle, a ripple effect that had begun long before Michael had even known about it. And now, he was a part of it. That night, he sat down at his small desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. "Tom, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. A year ago, I was a broken man. I had lost everything, my home, my daughter, my hope. And then, without warning, you stepped in. You didn't have to, but you did. And you did it quietly, expecting nothing in return. I can never repay you. But I understand now. That was never the point. You once asked me to promise that when I was in a position to help someone else, I would. No cameras, no credit. Just because I could. I want you to know that I have kept that promise. I see people now. The ones who feel invisible, just as I once did. And every time I extend my hand to help them, I remember what you did for me. So thank you. Not just for saving me, not just for helping me find my daughter, but for showing me that kindness is not about recognition. It is about action. I will never forget, and I will never stop paying it forward." Michael folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside a drawer. He never mailed it, because in the end, Tom did not need to read it. He already knew. Years passed. Michael's story became one that no one ever heard about. There were no viral news reports, no grand public acknowledgments. Just one man who had been saved, choosing to save others. One evening, as he sat in his office at the community center, he received a call. A young man, barely 20, had been brought in. Homeless, scared, and lost. Michael stood up, grabbed his coat, and went to meet him. As he entered the room, the young man looked up at him with wary eyes. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, suspicion laced in his voice. Michael smiled. He knew that question well. He extended his hand and said the same words that had changed his own life forever. "Because I can." And just like that, the cycle of kindness continued. Kindness is powerful, not because it is seen, but because it is felt. You never know whose life you might change with a single act of compassion. Sometimes it takes just one moment, one gesture, to turn someone's entire fate around. Tom Cruise never asked for credit. He never asked for recognition. He helped because he could. And now the question is, can you? If this story moved you, share it. Let kindness spread, because in the end, the greatest impact you can make is the one no one ever hears about. Subscribe to The Kindness Effect for more real-life inspirational stories. Like this video if you believe in the power of kindness. Comment below. What is the kindest act someone has ever done for you? And remember, when the moment comes when you see someone in need, help. Not for credit, not for cameras, but just because you can.